It was 9 a.m. on October 23rd, 4004 BC. After much consultation with the Bible, Egyptian and Jewish documents and chronologies, Archbishop James Ussher felt sure of his calculation. 9 a.m. on October 23rd, 4004 BC was when the earth was created. While the specificity of this estimate for when the world began has been subject to some derision and scorn over the years, this really was not a laughing matter at the time. It was essential to know when the earth was created in order to figure out when the rapture might occur. Geologists now know that the earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago, and life a mere billion years later. We know that the process of evolution unfolded after that, resulting in a world that had only single-celled life forms ultimately, over the next 3.5 billion years, to become the biodiversity that we see today. And this includes us. Just like geological time, life was also first understood through the lens of religion. Generally speaking, our understanding of human variation within the United States is primarily shaped by the work of scholars out of Europe. And so, in this video, we will explore the Western and Christian perspective on the Earth's biodiversity before the concept of evolution by natural selection was developed by Charles Darwin in 1859. One of the most influential concepts of how life forms were created is that of Archdeacon William Paley. He was a very religious man, and in the tradition of the time, he was fascinated with the biological world. The last book he wrote, entitled Natural Theology, see if I can pronounce it correctly, demonstrates so well how intertwined biology and religion were at the time. Paley used an analogy to demonstrate his point, so stick with me here. Imagine, if you will, that you are walking through a beautiful forest, birds chirping, wind rustling through the leaves. You turned off the path a long time ago and are wandering aimlessly in an area that it seems no other human has ever been. But then you notice a watch, just there, leaning against a tree. I know, work with me here. What would you think of this phenomenon? Would you assume that someone had left their watch by accident? You would likely assume that something as spectacular, as complicated as a pocket watch, it clearly implies that someone of great intelligence had put it there. This is what is known as the watchmaker analogy. The complexity of the design, it implies a complex designer. The complexity and awesomeness of life on Earth is evidence of an awesome designer who created it. God. The world was designed and is sustained by God. God is the watchmaker. Now, virtually all of the rich men at the time who occupied themselves by studying and documenting the wonderful diversity of life, they all did so as natural theologians, documenting the splendor of God's creations. Remember how Linnaeus said that God creates and Linnaeus categorizes? While most natural theologians were studying living organisms, there were some scholars in Europe studying the fossils of animals long ago. Georges Cuvier was a French anatomist who was very interested in bones from a quarry right outside of Paris. The quarry yields fossils from about 40 million years ago. And in fact, among the fossils he studied was one of the earliest primates that he named Adapus parisiensis, pictured from different perspectives here, and from the top, from the side, etc. So Cuvier clearly noticed that the bones of these creatures did not look like the bones of animals in France today, but how to explain how they got there? He did not take lightly his belief that God had created organisms as they are. So how could he explain the weird little fossils, such as this primate, without upsetting the essentiality of God's role in creation? Well, He came up with a very practical solution. He proposed that there had been a catastrophe that had wiped out the little primates and the other animals they lived alongside, and the animals of France today moved in to replace them. This hypothesis is called catastrophism, and it worked well. It preserved the harmony of a static Christian worldview with the dynamic change that characterizes evolution. Now, since fossil deposits represent little windows in time, and very rarely an entire bit of the picture, the gaps in the fossil record could be interpreted as giant floods or other catastrophes. Not everyone in the scholarly French community had such a static view of life. There was also this guy, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. He lived at the same time as Cuvier, but interpreted those fossils very differently. Lamarck thought that those were the ancestors of the animals living in the region today, but they had changed. He believed that there was change over time. See, Lamarck, he could see that people changed over their own lifetimes, that they developed strong muscles for certain tasks, making them all the better for it. So, for example, imagine the very strong arms of a blacksmith. Lamarck thought that those characteristics that an individual would acquire over their lifetime were traits, features, that they would then pass along to their offspring. We characterize this thinking as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck believed that organismal change could happen over time based on the use and the disuse of body parts. Perhaps the classic example of this is giraffe. So, to demonstrate Lamarck's view of evolution, let's think about the original short-necked giraffe ancestor. And these animals, they keep stretching their necks to reach leaves higher up on a tree. They continue stretching its neck until progressively the neck becomes longer and longer. And eventually, you have a long-necked descendant after many generations of this stretching. So another example could be these water birds. How did they get their long, skinny legs? Perhaps short-legged birds started wading into the water, but didn't want to get their feathery bums wet, so they stood up on their tiptoes, and the more they stood on their tiptoes over generations, the longer the legs got. Plausible in a Lamarckian perspective, but why might biologists today not consider this an acceptable scientific explanation? Well, this really raises a different question. What is science? I found this cute little YouTube video that helps answer this. Let's watch it.
Science is curiosity in action.
Science is looking for answers so that you can make better questions.
Science is a process. It's a set of rules we follow to test and falsify ideas.
Science is an invitation to ask the world how it works.
Science is a method of thought, so it refers to how you do things rather than what answer you get. A method of thought that seeks to explain the physical world. That doesn't mean it actually will explain, because maybe the explanation you were looking for turns out to be completely wrong. It seeks to explain the physical world because it doesn't look at important elements of the world that are not physical. For example, science doesn't deal with love, jealousy, justice, morality. Anything that is science can be tested and, if the data come out a certain way, proven wrong.
A hypothesis is an educated guess about how something works. Science is how we test to see whether our guess is right or wrong. So why do we do science?
To translate our individual wondering about how the world works into testable questions, which others can also get involved in.
So that we can understand why animals do what they do and how they do it.
We do it for fun.
In order to explain existence, causation, relationship, and interaction.
So our collective knowledge grows.
So that we can understand the causes of problems like pollution, disease, and climate change and fix them.
so that we can advance and balance the well-being of all life forms.
Now, another way to summarize this point is by pointing out, that, excuse me, the essence, actually, of a scientific proposition is that it can be tested by observation. Now, is Lamarck's inheritance of acquired characteristics testable by observation? Well, he had an explanation for the change over time. Now, what was it? He proposed that giraffe acquired longer necks because they needed them. The use of the object, the long neck, is why it came into being. Now, there's a word for this kind of logic: teleology. A teleological explanation is one that explains the existence or occurrence of something by citing a goal or purpose that is served by the thing. So, a knife is sharp because it is used for cutting. Sodium chloride, salt, is the way it is because it makes food tasty. No, that's not right. A knife is sharp because it was sharpened. Sodium chloride is a chemical composition. Those are teleological explanations, and they are not scientific explanations, or rather, they're not scientific hypotheses. Now, the slope of a mountain, it results from geological processes, not because they are great for skiing. A teleological view of life is pretty powerful. If organisms have their characteristics purposefully, because they need them, then there is an intentionality that's unavoidable. This intentionality underlies the concept of the great chain of being. Humans have such intelligence. We have created these complex cultures because we need them. Other animals don't, or can't do it, or some such thing. And if you think this, then there is a scale. Simple things at the bottom have yet to figure out, or they don't have a need to do the things, or they can't make the things because they don't need them. They don't do those things that humans do. So humans sit at the top of this great chain of being because we need our complexity. This is the scale of nature, the scala naturae. Now, to summarize, before Charles Darwin, European naturalists interpreted the world as static, that the animals we see today are exactly as they were when God created them in 4004 BC. They also believed that the world had order. Things were the way they were because they serve an obvious purpose, and the purpose was the reason that a characteristic existed. Now, an assumption that is built into this worldview that may not immediately be obvious, but is absolutely essential to note, is how these scholars interpreted variation. Now, when they looked at an animal, they focused on the generality of it, not the variation. So the minor differences between birds within the same species were irrelevant in a static worldview. Variation was just noise. It was something to be ignored, to be intentionally overlooked. Now, this all started to change in 1831 when a man named Charles Darwin stepped aboard a boat named the Beagle for a very long sea voyage.